The Nevada sun had already baked the hardpan to porcelain by 9 in the morning when Rachel Ortiz saw the photograph that would consume the next 18 months of her life. It arrived via Instagram direct message from an account she didn't recognize, a hiker's snapshot taken near the southern perimeter of the Nevada Test and Training Range, better known to the world as Area 51. The image showed a stretch of desert 20 miles from the nearest paved road, a place where dust devils carved temporary sculptures from alkali and sage. But it was the pattern in the sand that stopped Rachel's breath. 3 stones arranged in a triangle with a 4th offset to the northwest, the exact configuration her brother Danny had used since they were kids to mark camp whenever their family went hiking in the Sierras. Rachel enlarged the image on her phone screen until the pixels fractured. The stones were dark basalt, out of place in this pale desert. Around them, barely visible in the angled morning light, were what looked like scuff marks radiating outward, as though something had been dragged or swept clean. She screenshot the photo, noted the geotag coordinates, and opened the text thread she'd kept active for 5 years despite knowing no reply would ever come. "Danny, I think I found something." The message delivered but never showed as read, just like the 463 messages before it. 5 years earlier, in late August, Danny Ortiz had driven from Sacramento to Rachel's apartment in Las Vegas with 3 friends, all of them fresh out of UC Davis, with degrees they weren't using and student loans they couldn't ignore. The plan was simple, or at least it had seemed that way over beers and laughter. Drive out to the so-called extraterrestrial highway, do the tourist thing at the Little Ayla Inn in Rachel, Nevada, then push a little farther down the empty roads for photographs and bragging rights. Thousands of people made the pilgrimage every year. Conspiracy enthusiasts, aviation geeks, international tourists following a bucket list. They came in RVs and sedans and rented jeeps, took pictures by the black mailbox that had become a landmark, and drove home with stories. Nobody disappeared, but Danny, Marcus Chen, Lila Bosworth, and Tyler Nguyen never made it home. They checked out of the Motel 6 on Boulder Highway at 6 in the morning on August 27th, gassed up at a Shell station where security footage showed them buying Red Bulls and beef jerky, laughing about something Tyler said that made Lila shove him. They took State Route 375 north, the highway that locals and maps alike called the Extraterrestrial Highway, its signs decorated with cartoon UFOs. A convenience store clerk in Alamo remembered them stopping around 9, asking about road conditions farther north. The clerk said they seemed excited, normal, that Marcus bought a disposable camera because his phone battery had died. That was the last confirmed sighting. The Toyota 4Runner Danny had borrowed from his father was found 6 days later by a Bureau of Land Management ranger doing a routine patrol on a dirt access road 38 miles north of Route 375, about 12 miles from the southern boundary of the restricted zone. The SUV was unlocked, keys in the ignition, gas tank a quarter full. Inside, the ranger found 4 backpacks, 4 phones, 3 wallets, Lila's purse, 2 cases of bottled water with 6 bottles missing, the disposable camera Marcus had purchased, still in its plastic packaging, and a Nevada road atlas open to a page showing Lincoln County. What wasn't there were the 4 people who'd driven it. The initial search involved Lincoln County Sheriff's deputies, BLM Rangers, and eventually a search and rescue coordinator from the Nevada Division of Emergency Management. They worked a grid pattern radiating from the vehicle, covering 30 square miles over 9 days, with ground teams, a helicopter from the Nevada National Guard, and cadaver dogs borrowed from Las Vegas Metro. The terrain was unforgiving, high desert transitioning to scrubland, temperatures hitting 108 during the day, flash flood warnings in effect after afternoon thunderstorms that rolled through with biblical fury and then evaporated. They found boot prints leading away from the 4Runner, 4 sets heading roughly northwest, but the tracks disappeared after 200 yards, where hardpan gave way to rock shelf. A shredded T-shirt that might have been Tyler's was found caught on sagebrush half a mile out, but DNA testing came back inconclusive. After that, nothing. The case drew media attention because it checked every box for viral coverage. Young people, mysterious circumstances, the Area 51 connection that brought out every conspiracy theorist with a keyboard. Rachel watched her brother's face appear on news broadcasts, sandwiched between speculation about secret military tests and alien abduction. The comment sections filled with theories. Some claimed the group had stumbled into a classified test area and been detained or worse. Others insisted they'd been taken by unmarked government vehicles, disappeared into black site prisons. A fringe element suggested extraterrestrial involvement, that the proximity to Groom Lake wasn't coincidental. Rachel read every theory, chased every lead that seemed even remotely grounded, and ignored the rest. The official investigation stalled within 6 weeks. Lincoln County Sheriff's Department kept the case open, but had no new leads. The FBI field office in Las Vegas reviewed the file, found no evidence of federal crime or terrorism, and declined to take over. The Air Force Office of Special Investigations issued a terse statement confirming that no unauthorized personnel had breached the restricted area and that security protocols had not been violated. The families hired a private investigator, a former Metro detective named Victor Salazar, who'd worked missing persons for 15 years, but after 3 months and $12,000, even he admitted he'd hit bedrock. "People don't just vanish," he'd told Rachel over coffee at a diner off the Strip. "But sometimes the desert swallows evidence faster than we can document it." Rachel had been 24 when Danny disappeared, working as a paralegal for a personal injury firm and taking night classes toward a law degree she wasn't sure she wanted. In the aftermath, she'd put everything on hold. She'd taken FLET courses in search and rescue, learned to read topographic maps, and use a GPS unit that could mark waypoints and track back bearing. She'd driven out to the area where the Forerunner was found dozens of times, walking transects in patterns she'd learned from the SAR teams, carrying a backpack with water, a sat phone, a first aid kit, and printouts of the case file she'd assembled from FOIA requests and friendly deputies who'd bent the rules. She'd found nothing. Not a scrap of fabric, not a disturbed cairn, not a single piece of evidence the original search teams had missed. Her parents had eventually moved back to the version of life that existed before August 27th, a simulacrum of normalcy that required pretending their son might still walk through the door, with an explanation that made sense. Her father stopped talking about it entirely. Her mother joined an online support group for families of missing persons and developed a ritual of lighting a candle every Sunday. Rachel couldn't do either. She couldn't pretend, and she couldn't process grief for someone who might not be dead, so she existed in a third space, suspended between hope and acceptance, chasing leads that evaporated like mirages. By year 3, most of the leads had dried up. The other families had pursued different paths. Marcus Chen's parents had returned to the Bay Area and hired a psychic, which ended as badly as Rachel expected. Tyler Nguyen's older sister had organized annual vigils at the Little Ailey Inn, turning the anniversary into a gathering point for other families with missing loved ones, but the crowds dwindled each year. Lila Bosworth's father, a retired aerospace engineer, had filed repeated FOIA requests with every agency that touched Nevada's military ranges, building a sprawling theory about acoustic weapons testing that Rachel found both exhaustive and exhausting. He sent her emails with dense paragraphs about infrasound and directional energy, and she read them out of respect, but didn't believe them. The conspiracy theories had their own momentum, independent of facts or family wishes. Online forums dedicated to Area 51 picked apart every detail of the case. Someone claimed to have satellite imagery showing unusual vehicle tracks near the restricted zone on August 28th. Another insisted they'd intercepted encrypted radio traffic that mentioned unauthorized personnel. A YouTuber with 2 million subscribers devoted a 40-minute video to the disappearance, complete with dramatic reenactments and a theory involving underground facilities. Rachel watched it once, felt her stomach turn at the dramatization of Danny's last moments based on pure speculation, and never looked at that channel again. What the conspiracy theorists didn't understand, what they willfully ignored, was that the desert didn't need help being deadly. Rachel had learned this through hundreds of hours of research and fieldwork. The Nevada high desert was a place where temperatures could swing 50 degrees between day and night, where flash floods carved new channels through terrain that looked bone dry, where distances were deceptive and landmarks shifted depending on the angle of the sun. People died out there regularly. Hikers who underestimated the heat, off-roaders who got stuck and tried to walk out, adventurers who thought GPS made them invincible until their batteries died and they realized they had no backup plan. The search and rescue statistics were grim. According to data Rachel had obtained from the Nevada Division of Emergency Management, Lincoln County alone averaged 12 search and rescue operations per year in the desert regions, with roughly 30% ending in fatality. The causes varied: dehydration, exposure, falls, vehicle accidents, medical emergencies, but the common thread was underestimation. People thought they could handle conditions they'd never experienced, and by the time they realized their mistake, they were too deep to self-rescue. Rachel had interviewed SAR coordinators, rangers, and experienced desert guides. They all told variations of the same story. The desert forgave nothing. A twisted ankle 5 miles from your vehicle could be a death sentence if you didn't have enough water or if you'd told no one where you were going. A wrong turn that added 3 miles to your route could mean the difference between making it back and dying of exposure. And the psychological factors were just as dangerous as the physical ones: panic, disorientation, the decision to press forward instead of turning back, the belief that the next ridge would reveal salvation. One SAR coordinator, a woman named Barbara Chen, who'd been working rescues for 20 years, told Rachel something that stuck with her. Most people who die out here make a series of small mistakes, not one big one. They leave later than planned, so they're hiking in peak heat. They bring less water than they should because they underestimate distance. They trust technology without understanding its limitations. They keep pushing when they should turn around because turning back feels like failure. By the time they realize they're in real trouble, they've burned through their safety margins and they're operating in the red. At that point, survival becomes a matter of luck as much as skill. That conversation had changed how Rachel understood her brother's disappearance. She stopped looking for a single catastrophic event: a fall, an encounter with wildlife, a sudden medical emergency, and started thinking in terms of cascading errors. What small decisions had Danny and his friends made that seemed reasonable at the time but compounded into disaster? And if she could reconstruct that chain of decisions, maybe she could understand not just what happened, but why. The night she received the Instagram message with the stone marker photograph, Rachel couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, scrolling through the case file on her tablet. A collection of documents she'd assembled over 5 years that was more comprehensive than anything law enforcement had. She had copies of the initial missing persons reports, the search operation logs, weather data from the week of the disappearance, topographic maps marked with search sectors, witness statements from everyone who'd seen the group on their last day, phone records showing the last time each of their devices had pinged a cell tower, and dozens of photographs of the area taken during different seasons and times of day. She pulled up the vehicle discovery report, written by the BLM ranger who'd found the Forerunner. His name was Tom Hadfield, a 30-year veteran who'd worked the Nevada desert since the 80s. His report was thorough and professional, but reading between the lines, Rachel could sense his puzzlement. The vehicle was in good condition, no mechanical problems, plenty of gas to drive out. The supplies inside suggested the group had planned for a day trip, not an extended excursion. The fact that they'd left their phones and wallets made no sense unless they'd intended to return quickly, maybe within an hour or two, but they'd never come back. Hadfield had noted the boot prints heading northwest and had followed them as far as he could before losing the trail. His report included his assessment that the group appeared to have been walking purposefully, not wandering aimlessly, and that the spacing of the prints suggested they were together, not separated. He'd also noted something that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt crucial. The prints showed a consistent gait, no dragging or stumbling, which suggested that at the point where he'd observed them, none of the group members were injured or in distress. Rachel had spoken to Hadfield twice over the years. The first time was 3 months after the disappearance, when she was still raw with grief and desperate for any detail he might have forgotten to include in his report. He'd been kind but firm, telling her that he'd documented everything he'd seen and that he'd looked for those kids as hard as anyone. The second conversation was 2 years later, after Rachel had completed her SAR training and understood better what she was asking. Hadfield had been more open then, treating her as a colleague rather than a grieving family member. He'd told her about the challenges of that particular search operation. The area where the Forerunner was found was vast and geologically complex, a transition zone between different desert ecosystems with terrain that ranged from flat hardpan to broken badlands. The search grid had been drawn based on standard probability models, concentric circles radiating from the last known point, but those models assumed rational behavior and didn't account for the possibility that the missing persons had kept moving after becoming lost. Hadfield suspected that's what had happened, that Danny and his friends had walked farther than anyone expected, possibly believing they were heading toward a road or landmark, when in fact they were moving deeper into the wilderness. The weather during the search operation had been another complication. The afternoon thunderstorms had rolled through daily, dumping rain in violent bursts that erased tracks and created flash flooding in low-lying areas. The helicopter had been grounded twice because of wind and visibility issues, and the heat had been oppressive, limiting how long ground teams could work before needing to retreat to air-conditioned vehicles. Hadfield had told Rachel that, in his opinion, the search had been as thorough as conditions allowed, but he'd also admitted that there were sectors they'd only been able to cover from the air, and that overhead observation could easily miss human remains in terrain with heavy brush or rock cover. Now, 5 years later, Rachel had a photograph of stone markers that Danny might have left. It was the first physical evidence that any of them had been alive beyond the point where their tracks disappeared. She spent the hours until dawn studying the photograph, trying to extract every possible piece of information. The stones themselves were basalt, volcanic rock that was common in the region but distinct from the lighter-colored sedimentary rock that dominated the immediate area around the Forerunner. That suggested Danny had traveled far enough to enter a different geological zone, which matched Hadfield's theory about them moving farther than expected. The arrangement of the stones was deliberate, no question. Rachel had dozens of photographs from family camping trips showing Danny's markers, and the pattern was identical. 3 stones in an equilateral triangle, roughly 2 feet per side, with a 4th stone placed about 3 feet away on one side. Danny had always oriented the offset stone to point in the direction of travel, or towards something significant: water, camp, the car. In this photograph, the offset stone pointed northwest. If Danny had left this marker, he'd been indicating that his direction of travel continued northwest from this point. The scuff marks around the stones were harder to interpret. They could have been made by Danny's boots as he arranged the rocks, or they could indicate something else: someone dragging supplies, a scuffle, an attempt to clear an area for a camp. Rachel wished the photograph had higher resolution, but the Instagram compression had degraded the fine details. She made a note to ask the person who'd taken it if they had the original uncompressed file. She checked the geotag coordinates against her maps. The marker was approximately 6 miles northwest of where the Forerunner had been found, which meant Danny and the others had covered significant distance before leaving this sign. 6 miles in desert terrain, probably carrying whatever supplies they'd taken from the vehicle in late August heat. That was a serious undertaking. Rachel pulled up the weather archive for August 27th and 28th of that year. High temperatures both days had reached 106 degrees, with low humidity and almost no cloud cover. Walking 6 miles in those conditions would have depleted their water reserves significantly, even if they'd been prepared. She traced the line northwest from the marker location on her topographic map. The terrain rose gradually toward a series of low ridges, then dropped into what looked like a drainage system, a network of seasonal washes that only carried water during storms. Beyond that, the map showed increasingly rough terrain, volcanic formations and badlands that would be difficult to navigate on foot. There were no roads, no structures, no indication of water or shelter. If Danny and the others had continued northwest from the marker, they'd been heading into some of the most inhospitable country in southern Nevada. Unless they'd had a reason. Rachel zoomed in on the map, studying the contour lines and geological annotations. About 8 miles northwest of the marker location, she found what she was looking for, a notation indicating a canyon system. The map didn't provide much detail, just a suggestion of erosional features cutting through the volcanic rock. But it was something. Canyons meant shelter from sun, possibly shade, and in rare cases, seep springs where water collected in rock depressions. If Danny had seen the ridgeline that hinted at canyons, he might have decided it was worth pushing toward them. Rachel pulled up satellite imagery, trying to get a better sense of the canyon system. The resolution wasn't great, the area was far from major population centers, and the satellites hadn't prioritized detailed coverage. But she could make out darker areas that suggested deep cuts in the terrain. She marked the location and started calculating distances and bearing. From the stone marker to the canyon system was roughly 8 miles. That was a full day's hike in good conditions, longer in the heat, and that was assuming relatively direct navigation without detours around obstacles. She thought about the group's physical condition. Danny had been in good shape. He'd run half marathons and did regular gym work. Marcus had been less athletic, but not out of shape. Tyler had been a casual hiker, weekend trips in Napa, nothing extreme. Lila had done some backpacking in college but hadn't kept it up. None of them were experienced desert travelers. They'd have been exhausted by the heat, dehydrated, possibly dealing with blisters and muscle cramps. The decision to push for the canyons would have been born of desperation, the calculation that staying put meant dying slowly, versus the risk of dying quickly while trying to find help. At 6 in the morning, Rachel sent a message to Jeremy Kinsella, the geology student who'd taken the photograph. "I'm planning to hike out to the marker location you photographed. I think it was left by my brother. Would you be willing to meet me there and show me exactly where you found it? I understand if that's too much to ask, but I'd be grateful for the help." She attached a brief explanation of who she was and why the marker mattered, then sat back and waited for a response. It came 20 minutes later. "I'm so sorry about your brother. I'm still in the area doing fieldwork for another week. I can definitely meet you and show you the exact location. I'll bring copies of my field notes with GPS data. When were you thinking of going?" Rachel looked at her calendar. She had a court appearance on Thursday that she couldn't miss, but after that her schedule was clear. "How about Friday morning? I can drive out Thursday night and camp somewhere nearby if you can recommend a spot." Jeremy responded with detailed directions to a BLM camping area about 15 miles from the marker location, along with a topographic map file showing the route he'd taken. "We should plan to meet at sunrise. The heat gets brutal by mid-morning this time of year. Bring more water than you think you'll need, at least 2 gallons per person, and let someone know where you're going. This isn't a place you want to get stuck alone." The warning was unnecessary. Rachel had learned desert protocol the hard way. but she appreciated the concern. She confirmed the meeting time and then started making preparations. She'd need to notify the Lincoln County Sheriff's Department that she was going out to investigate a potential lead. Protocol required that, and besides, if she found something significant, she'd need them involved anyway. She drafted an email to Deputy Sarah Martinez, who'd been her primary contact in the department for the past 3 years, explaining about the photograph and her plan to investigate. Deputy Martinez called within an hour. "Rachel, I appreciate you keeping us in the loop. I have to tell you, those stone markers in the desert are pretty common. Hikers leave them, surveyors, even kids playing around. I don't want you to get your hopes up that this is connected to your brother." Rachel had expected skepticism. "I know it's a long shot, but the pattern matches exactly what Danny used to do, and the location is consistent with the direction his tracks were heading when you lost them. I'm not asking for department resources. I just want to check it out, and I wanted you to know in case I find something that requires official follow-up." Martinez sighed. "Okay, but you're not going out there alone, right? You've got someone going with you?" Rachel explained about Jeremy Kinsella, provided his contact information and university affiliation so Martinez could verify he was legitimate. The deputy agreed to put a note in the case file about Rachel's planned investigation and made Rachel promise to call in once she was back out of the field. "If you're not back by Saturday evening, I'm sending someone to look for you. And Rachel, I mean this respectfully, but you need to be prepared for the possibility that even if those markers are your brother's, it doesn't mean you're going to find him. The desert keeps things, and sometimes it doesn't give them back." Rachel spent the rest of the week preparing. She updated her will, not because she expected something to go wrong, but because going into the desert without ensuring her affairs were in order was foolish. She packed her Subaru with gear, camping equipment, food for 3 days, 6 gallons of water, a comprehensive first aid kit, a satellite phone with a prepaid plan that included emergency beacon service, extra batteries for everything, and a paper backup of all her maps and notes in case electronics failed. She packed Danny's old hiking boots, which she'd kept in her closet, and a photograph of the two of them from a camping trip 5 years before everything fell apart. Thursday evening, she made the drive from Las Vegas to the BLM camping area Jeremy had recommended. The route took her north on Highway 93, then east onto Highway 375, the extraterrestrial highway. She passed the Little Ailey Inn just after sunset, the quirky motel and restaurant lit up against the darkening sky, a beacon for tourists and true believers. She'd been there 3 times over the years, talking to staff and regular customers, hoping someone would remember Danny and his friends. A bartender had vague recollection of a group matching their description, but couldn't pin down a date, and Rachel had learned that human memory was unreliable enough that such testimony was worthless without corroboration. Past the Little Ailey Inn, the highway stretched through darkness so complete it felt solid. Rachel's headlights carved a tunnel through the night, catching the reflective eyes of jackrabbits and the occasional coyote. She turned onto a dirt road, marked only by a small BLM sign, followed it for 8 miles at crawling speed to avoid shredding her tires on rocks, and finally reached the camping area. It was nothing more than a cleared space with a fire ring and a weathered picnic table, but after 5 hours of driving it looked like sanctuary. She set up her tent by flashlight, ate a cold dinner of trail mix and jerky, and lay in her sleeping bag watching stars through the mesh roof. The Milky Way was a river of light, the kind of sky you could only see far from cities. Danny had loved this, the silence and vastness, the feeling of being a small part of something incomprehensibly large. Rachel remembered a conversation they'd had on a backpacking trip in the Sierras when she'd been 16 and he'd been 18. He'd said something about how being in wild places reminded him that his problems weren't as big as they seemed, that the universe had no opinion about his failed chemistry test or his breakup with his girlfriend. At the time, she'd thought it was typical Big Brother wisdom, slightly pretentious but well-meaning. Now she wished she'd paid more attention, memorized his exact words, because memory had a way of smoothing edges and filling gaps until you weren't sure what was real and what you'd reconstructed. She woke before dawn to the sound of wind rattling the tent fabric. The desert morning was cold, temperature in the low 50s, and she dressed quickly in layers that she'd peel off as the day heated up. She made coffee on her camp stove, instant but better than nothing, and was finishing her second cup when she saw headlights approaching. Jeremy's truck pulled in next to her Subaru, and he climbed out wearing the same field vest she remembered, a backpack slung over one shoulder. "Morning," he said, accepting the coffee she offered. "Beautiful spot. I've camped here a few times. Good views of the Groom Range, if you're into watching for weird lights, though I've never seen anything stranger than a helicopter." Rachel smiled. "I think I've had enough conspiracy theories to last a lifetime." She showed him her maps and explained her theory about the stone markers pointing toward the canyon system. Jeremy listened, asked intelligent questions, and then pulled out his own maps, which showed geological formations in detail that standard topographic maps lacked. He pointed to the area where he'd found the markers. "This is interesting. The basalt you see around the markers is from a Pliocene-era volcanic field. It's not native to where the vehicle was found, which means either your brother carried those rocks for miles, unlikely, or he found them near where he placed them, which suggests he'd traveled into the volcanic zone. The nearest outcrop of that particular basalt is about 5 miles from the marker site. That matched Rachel's assessment. If Danny had placed the marker after finding the stones nearby, it meant the group had covered 11 miles from the forerunner before leaving the sign. That was nearly twice the distance the original search had estimated. No wonder the SAR teams hadn't found them. They finished their coffee, did a final gear check, and loaded into Jeremy's truck for the drive to the trailhead. The term trailhead was generous. It was just a spot where the dirt road became impassable, even for a high-clearance vehicle, a jumble of rocks and a wash that had cut through the track during some past flood. They parked, shouldered their packs, and started walking as the sun broke over the eastern horizon. The landscape was beautiful in the early light, all amber and shadow, the vegetation sparse but varied. Creosote bushes with their distinctive smell, clumps of rabbit brush not yet blooming, scattered yucca standing like sentinels. The ground crunched under their boots, a mix of sand and gravel and volcanic cinders that got into everything. Rachel had forgotten how much she loved this, the physical challenge, the simplicity of putting one foot in front of the other, the way the desert demanded full attention because a moment of carelessness could mean a twisted ankle or a close encounter with a rattlesnake. Jeremy led the way, navigating by GPS, but also by geological landmarks, rock formations, and color changes that told stories about ancient eruptions and erosion. He pointed out features as they walked, educating her in the processes that had shaped this landscape over millions of years. It was clear he loved what he did, that he saw beauty in arrangements of rock and ash that most people would dismiss as barren wasteland. They reached the marker site after 90 minutes of steady hiking. Jeremy consulted his GPS, then pointed. "Right there. I was doing a magnetic susceptibility survey when I spotted it. At first, I thought it was just random rocks, but then I saw the pattern, and it struck me as intentional. I took the photo and posted about it on the Nevada SAR forum, because I figured someone might know if it meant something." Rachel approached the stones slowly, the same way she had in her imagination 100 times since seeing the photograph. Up close, they were exactly as she remembered from childhood camping trips. 3 stones forming a triangle, the 4th offset to the northwest. She knelt beside them, her hand hovering over the nearest stone but not touching, afraid that contact would break some spell. "This is his," she said, her voice thick. "This is definitely his marker." Jeremy gave her space, understanding that this was a moment that didn't need intrusion. Rachel photographed the stones from every angle, measuring the distances between them with a tape measure and recording the coordinates with her own GPS unit. Then she looked at the scuff marks surrounding the arrangement. They were faint. 5 years of wind and rain had softened them, but they were there. And now that she was seeing them in person rather than in a compressed digital image, she could see they weren't random. They formed a pattern, a cleared area roughly 6 feet across, as though someone had swept the ground clean or dragged something across it. She stood and started walking slowly in expanding circles around the marker, eyes on the ground. Jeremy joined the search without being asked, the two of them moving in opposite directions, covering the area systematically. Rachel had walked maybe 30 feet from the marker when she saw it, a small depression between 2 rocks, almost invisible unless you knew to look. She knelt and reached into the depression, her fingers closing around something that didn't belong. It was a Ziploc bag, the kind used for sandwiches, and inside was a piece of paper folded into quarters. The plastic was dirty and had started to degrade from UV exposure, but it had done its job. The paper inside was protected, still dry. Rachel's hands shook as she opened the bag and unfolded the paper. Danny's handwriting filled the page, cramped and urgent. If anyone finds this, we went northwest toward the hills, following what we thought was a trail. Lost. Water running low. Mark this spot. Day 3. Found shelter ahead. Going to wait there for rescue. Tyler hurt his ankle. Can't walk far. This was supposed to be fun. Tell Mom and Dad I'm sorry. Rachel read the note 3 times, tears blurring her vision. Day 3. That meant they'd been alive at least 3 days after leaving the Forerunner, longer than the original search had estimated their water would last. They'd rationed, pushed themselves, kept moving even when every rational instinct said to stop. And they'd found shelter, some kind of structure or natural formation ahead, northwest along the bearing the offset stone indicated. Jeremy was beside her now, reading over her shoulder. The shelter he mentions, that could be the canyon system we identified on the maps. If they made it that far, they would have had shade, protection from the sun. That would have significantly extended their survival time. Rachel folded the note carefully and placed it back in the Ziploc bag. This is evidence, she said. We need to document exactly where it was found and then get it to the sheriff's department. But first, we need to see if there's anything else here, and then we need to figure out if we can reach the shelter Danny mentioned. They spent the next hour searching the area around the marker, working in careful grid patterns, photographing anything that looked even remotely out of place. Jeremy found a second item, a metal button, tarnished and half buried in sand. He pulled it free and showed it to Rachel. It was silver-colored, about 1 inch in diameter, with a decorative pattern embossed on the front. Rachel turned it over in her palm and saw scratches on the back, shallow marks that could have been accidental or could have been deliberate. She pulled out her phone and enlarged the image of the button's back surface. The scratches resolved into letters, crude but readable. GPS dead. Phone dead. Canyon ahead. Danny, or one of the others, had carved a message into the button, a backup in case the note was lost or damaged. The message confirmed what the note said. Their electronics were dead, and they were heading for a canyon. Rachel felt something shift in her chest, hope mixing with dread. They'd left a trail, breadcrumbs for someone to follow. Danny had been thinking clearly enough to mark the route, to leave multiple indicators. That meant he'd been functional, not delirious, or in the late stages of dehydration. It meant they'd had a plan, however desperate. She called Deputy Martinez on the sat phone, explained what they'd found, and gave precise coordinates. Martinez was silent for a moment, then said she'd send someone out to collect the evidence, but it would be several hours before they could get a team together. In the meantime, she made Rachel promise not to continue northwest without official support. This is a recovery operation now, Rachel, not a search and rescue. I can't have civilians going deeper into that terrain. If your brother and his friends are out there, they've been there for 5 years. A few more hours won't make a difference. Rachel wanted to argue, wanted to say that every minute mattered, but she knew Martinez was right. Going forward without backup was stupid. So she agreed to wait, and she and Jeremy returned to the marker site to document everything in exhaustive detail while they waited for the sheriff's department to arrive. But as the sun climbed higher and the heat began to build, Rachel found herself staring northwest toward the ridgeline where the canyon system waited. Danny had gone that way. He'd been hurt, frightened, running out of time, but he'd kept moving. And somewhere in that broken landscape, she was going to find out what happened to him. If you've been following this story, if you understand why finding answers matters even when they come 5 years too late, consider hitting that subscribe button, because this is just the beginning of a search that's going to take us deep into one of the most unforgiving landscapes in North America. The sheriff's department sent 2 deputies, Sarah Martinez and a younger man named Chris Dalton, who joined the force after the original search. They arrived just after noon in a department SUV that had seen hard use, dust coating every surface, a light bar on the roof that seemed more optimistic than practical in terrain this rough. Martinez greeted Rachel with a handshake that was firm but not unkind, the greeting of someone who'd dealt with enough grieving families to know that false hope was crueler than honest assessment. She examined the stone markers first, photographing them from multiple angles and taking measurements that she compared against Rachel's notes. Then she opened the Ziploc bag with gloved hands, read Danny's note without comment, and sealed it in an evidence bag. The button went into a second bag. She asked Jeremy to walk her through exactly where and how he'd found the markers, and she made him repeat the sequence twice while Dalton took notes. When she was satisfied with the documentation, Martinez stood and looked northwest, shading her eyes against the glare. Your brother said they were heading for Shelter, a canyon most likely based on the topography. That's consistent with survival training: get out of the sun, find shade, conserve energy and water. The question is how far they made it. Rachel showed her the map she'd marked with the canyon system's location. 8 miles from here, give or take. That's a long way in their condition, but it's not impossible. Martinez studied the maps, then looked at Dalton. What do you think? Can we get a team out here by tomorrow morning? Dalton checked his radio, had a brief conversation with someone at the department, then shook his head. SIAR coordinator says we're stretched thin. There's a missing hiker situation up near Great Basin National Park that's pulling resources. Best he can do is Thursday, 3 days from now. Rachel felt frustration rising in her throat. 3 days. My brother left a note saying they found shelter. If there's any chance there's evidence in that canyon, every day we wait is a day the wind can bury it or scatter it. Martinez's expression was sympathetic, but unmoved. I understand your frustration, but we don't have the resources to mount an operation on short notice, and sending a couple of deputies into unknown terrain without proper support is a good way to create more victims. The canyon system you've identified is in a remote area with no easy access. We'd need at least 4 people, preferably 6, plus medical support and communication relay. That takes planning. What if I went ahead? Rachel said, not alone, with Jeremy here. We'd stay in constant communication via sat phone, check in every hour, and if we found anything significant, we'd mark it and withdraw. You could have a team ready to go in if we located something worth pursuing. Martinez's answer was immediate and non-negotiable. Absolutely not. You're a civilian, and this is now an active investigation. I appreciate everything you've done to get us this far, but I can't authorize you to continue into that terrain. If something happened to you, the county would be liable, and more importantly, I'd be responsible. I'm not willing to take that risk. Jeremy cleared his throat. What if I went? I'm out here doing legitimate field work. I have university backing, insurance, emergency protocols. If I happen to do some geological surveying in the direction of that canyon system and happen to notice anything that might be relevant to your investigation, that's just good citizenship. Martinez gave him a long look. That's creative, but it doesn't change my answer. I'm asking both of you, as a formal request from law enforcement, to stay clear of that area until we can mount a proper operation. Can you do that? Rachel wanted to lie, to agree, and then do what she'd planned anyway, but Martinez had been good to her over the years, had bent rules and shared information that wasn't public. She owed her honesty. I can't promise that, she said. Danny's my brother. If there's a chance he's out there, even if it's just his remains, I need to know. I've spent 5 years not knowing. I can't spend 3 more days sitting on my hands when I'm this close. Martinez was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving between Rachel and the horizon. Finally she sighed. I can't stop you from hiking in public land, but if you go, you're not going as part of any official investigation. Anything you find might not be admissible. And if you disturb a scene, you could compromise evidence. You understand that? Rachel nodded. I'll document everything. I won't touch anything except to photograph and mark locations, and I'll call you the moment I find something. Martinez pulled out a business card and wrote a number on the back. That's my personal cell. It won't work out here, but once you're back in range, call me before you call anyone else. And Rachel, if you find human remains, you don't disturb them. You mark the location and you walk away. Let us do our job. The deal struck. Martinez and Dalton packed up their evidence and drove back towards civilization, leaving Rachel and Jeremy alone with the stone markers and the question of what came next. Jeremy pulled out his water bottles, handed one to Rachel and said, "So I'm guessing we're not waiting 3 days." Rachel took a long drink, feeling the water cut through the dust in her throat. We leave at sunrise tomorrow. We'll hike to the canyon, see if there's any sign they made it that far, and if we find something significant, we call it in and wait for backup. If we don't find anything, we come back and let the official search run its course. Either way, I need to know. They hiked back to their vehicles as the afternoon heat reached its peak, the temperature pushing past 110 degrees. The landscape shimmered with heat distortion, and Rachel felt sweat soaking through her shirt despite the dry air. By the time they reached the trucks, she'd drained 2 liters of water and was still thirsty. Jeremy looked in better shape, acclimated from weeks of fieldwork, but even he was moving slowly. They drove back to the BLM camping area and spent the afternoon in the shade of Jeremy's tent, a larger structure than Rachel's with mesh panels that allowed airflow. Jeremy pulled out his field notes and geological maps, and they planned the next day's route. The canyon system was too far to reach in a single day of hiking from where they'd parked, so Jeremy proposed driving to a different access point, a dirt track that got closer to the target area. According to his maps, there was a route used occasionally by miners and rockhounds that passed within 4 miles of the canyon's mouth. It wasn't marked on standard maps, but it was documented in geological survey records from the 70s. Jeremy had driven part of it during his fieldwork, and he thought his truck could handle the rest. That would cut their hiking distance in half and give them a reasonable chance of reaching the canyon, searching it, and getting back before dark. Rachel studied the proposed route, tracing it with her finger on the map. It made sense, but it also meant committing fully. Once they were that deep in the backcountry, there was no quick way out if something went wrong. She thought about Martinez's warning, about the liability and the risk, and then she thought about Danny's note. Day 3. Tell Mum and Dad I'm sorry. She made her decision. We do it. We leave at first light, take the mining road as far as it goes, and hike the rest. We bring enough water for 2 days, just in case, and we check in with Martinez every 2 hours. If we don't find anything by mid-afternoon, we turn around and come back. Jeremy nodded. And if we do find something, then we document it, mark it with GPS coordinates, and wait for the official team. We don't touch anything. We don't disturb any potential evidence. We just confirm it's there and let law enforcement do their job. They spent the evening preparing gear, organizing supplies into weight-balanced packs, checking batteries and backup batteries, reviewing emergency protocols. Rachel went through her medical kit, making sure she had everything they might need for a serious injury: splints, pressure bandages, trauma shears, a tourniquet. She packed a snakebite kit, even though she knew its effectiveness was limited. The best treatment for a rattlesnake bite was rapid evacuation to a hospital, but out here rapid meant hours, and she wanted options. As the sun set, they made dinner on Jeremy's camp stove, a simple meal of instant rice and canned chicken that tasted better than it should after a long day. They ate in comfortable silence, watching the sky transition from blue to purple to star-studded black. Rachel thought about all the times she'd sat like this with Danny, sharing meals on camping trips, talking about everything and nothing. He'd been her protector when they were kids, the older brother who checked under her bed for monsters and taught her to ride a bike. Later, he'd been her friend, someone who understood her in ways their parents never quite did. She'd been 20, and he'd been 22 when they'd hiked the John Muir Trail together, 22 days in the Sierra Nevada that had been the best vacation of Rachel's life. They'd talked about their futures, about the paths they wanted to take, about their fears and hopes. Danny had said he wanted to do something that mattered, that left the world a little better than he'd found it. He hadn't figured out what that meant yet, but he was working on it. Rachel had teased him about his earnestness, but secretly she'd admired it, the belief that individual action could make a difference. Now she wondered if he'd had time to think about any of that in his last hours. If he'd been philosophical or angry, or just consumed with the immediate need to survive. She hoped it had been the latter, that he'd been too busy trying to save himself and his friends to dwell on abstract meaning. But knowing Danny, she suspected he'd been thinking about more than just survival, about what he'd leave behind, about the people he loved, and what he wished he'd said to them. Jeremy must have sensed her mood, because he said quietly, "Tell me about him, your brother. What was he like?" Rachel considered the question, trying to find words that would capture someone as complex as Danny. "He was kind," she said finally. "That sounds generic, but it's true. He was the person who'd drive 2 hours to help you move furniture, who'd listen to your problems at 3 in the morning, who'd remember your birthday when everyone else forgot. He was also stubborn as hell. Once he decided something was right, he couldn't be talked out of it. That got him in trouble sometimes, but it also meant you could trust him completely. If Danny said he'd do something, it got done." She paused, looking up at the stars. He loved this. Being outside, being away from cities and crowds. He used to say that modern life was too loud, too cluttered, that people needed empty spaces to think clearly. I think that's why he wanted to come out here, to the middle of nowhere, Nevada. He wanted to see what it felt like to be truly alone, to test himself against something real, and instead it killed him. Jeremy was quiet for a moment. "From what you've told me, it sounds like he fought hard. The markers, the notes, the fact that they made it as far as they did, that takes intelligence and determination. A lot of people in their situation would have panicked, made impulsive decisions that got them killed faster. Your brother kept his head, made rational choices, left a trail for someone to follow. That counts for something." Rachel appreciated the effort, the attempt to find meaning in tragedy, but she wasn't sure she believed it. Danny's intelligence and determination hadn't saved him. The desert hadn't cared about his good intentions or his resourcefulness. It had killed him anyway. Him and 3 other people who'd done nothing wrong except underestimate the landscape and overestimate their ability to handle it. But she thanked Jeremy anyway, because the attempt mattered. The willingness to sit with someone else's grief without trying to fix it or minimize it. They talked for a while longer, shifting to easier topics: Jeremy's research, Rachel's work as a paralegal, the places they'd traveled. Eventually, Rachel retreated to her tent, set an alarm for 4 in the morning, and tried to sleep. She woke before the alarm, pulled from restless dreams by anxiety and anticipation. She lay in the dark for a while, listening to the wind move across the desert, carrying the smell of sage and dust. Then she dressed, packed her tent, and started coffee water heating on her camp stove. Jeremy emerged from his tent a few minutes later, looking as tired as she felt. They ate a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and dried fruit, loaded gear into Jeremy's truck, and were on the road before the sun cleared the horizon. The mining track Jeremy had mentioned was barely visible. Two ruts through the scrubland that looked like they hadn't seen traffic in years. The truck bounced and lurched over rocks and through shallow washes, the suspension working hard, the frame creaking with each impact. Rachel held onto the oh-shit handle and tried not to think about what would happen if they broke an axle or shredded a tire this far from help. After an hour of brutal driving, Jeremy pulled to a stop at the edge of a wash that had cut across the track, creating a drop-off too steep to navigate. "This is as far as we can take the vehicle. We hike from here." They unloaded packs, locked the truck, and started walking. The sun was fully up now, the temperature already climbing into the 90s. Rachel fell into the rhythm of desert hiking, head down, watching for obstacles, conserving energy. Jeremy led, navigating by GPS and landmark, occasionally stopping to consult his maps or take photographs of rock formations that interested him. They reached the ridgeline Danny had mentioned in his note after 2 hours of steady climbing. The view from the top was expansive, miles of desert stretching in every direction, broken by volcanic plugs and eroded badlands. To the northwest, Rachel could see the canyon system, a dark gash in the landscape that was deeper and longer than the maps had suggested. Jeremy pointed toward it. "That's our target. The canyon runs roughly north-south for about 3 miles. If your brother and his friends made it this far, they probably entered at the southern end because it's the most accessible. We'll start there and work our way in." The descent from the ridgeline was treacherous, loose scree and boulders that shifted underfoot. Rachel had to use her hands as much as her feet, scrambling down slopes that were barely this side of a controlled fall. Twice she slipped, catching herself with her palms and tearing skin on rough stone. Jeremy moved with the confidence of someone who spent his life in terrain like this, but even he was cautious, testing each handhold before committing his weight. They reached the canyon mouth just before noon, both of them breathing hard, sweat-soaked despite the dry air. The temperature had pushed past 100 degrees, and Rachel's lips were cracked, despite the water she'd been drinking steadily. She pulled out her sat phone and called Martinez, reporting their location and status. Martinez was not happy. "You should have waited for the official team. If you get hurt out there, we're looking at a complex rescue operation with limited resources." "I hope you know what you're doing." Rachel did know. She was gambling that finding answers was worth the risk, that closure mattered more than safety. She ended the call and followed Jeremy into the canyon. The temperature dropped immediately, the walls blocking direct sun, and creating shade that felt miraculous after hours of exposure. The canyon floor was packed sand, littered with rocks, and along the left wall, Rachel saw what looked like the remnants of a campfire, a ring of stones with charcoal in the center. She knelt and sifted through the ash. It was old, brittle, the kind that crumbled to powder. But beneath it she found the melted remnants of a plastic water bottle, the logo still faintly visible. Arrowhead, the same brand they'd found in the Forerunner. Rachel felt her pulse accelerate. They'd been here. Danny and the others had made it this far, had built a fire, had tried to establish some kind of camp. She photographed the fire ring from multiple angles, measured its dimensions, and recorded the GPS coordinates. Then she started searching the surrounding area. 20 feet farther into the canyon, she found a torn piece of fabric caught on a sharp edge of rock. It was faded denim, sun-bleached, nearly white, but the weave was still visible. She compared it mentally to the clothing descriptions from the original missing persons reports. Marcus had been wearing a denim jacket. She bagged the fabric carefully, marking the exact location, and continued deeper into the canyon. The walls narrowed as they progressed, rising higher until they blocked everything but a strip of sky overhead. The air was cooler but heavier, and Rachel's sense of direction began to falter. The canyon twisted and turned, branching occasionally into narrow side passages that led nowhere. She tried to think like Danny, to imagine what he would do in this situation. He'd been a planner, someone who thought through options and calculated risks. He'd have looked for the most sheltered spot, somewhere with shade and protection from wind, somewhere that felt defensible. After another 100 yards, the canyon opened into a small amphitheater, a circular space where the walls curved back to create a natural shelter. And there, in the center, were more signs of habitation. A crude lean-to made from branches and a torn tarp, the fabric bleached nearly white by years of sun and weather, empty food wrappers, granola bar packaging, a crushed soda can. And something else, a piece of paper weighted down by a rock, protected from the wind by the overhang of the lean-to. Rachel approached slowly, every muscle tense. She lifted the rock and picked up the paper. It was thicker than the first note Danny had left, torn from something more substantial, and the handwriting was different. Lila's handwriting, precise and looping. The note was dated September 1st, 5 days after they'd been reported missing. "We're stuck. Tyler broke his ankle on the second day when he fell scrambling down into this canyon. We've been rationing water, but it's almost gone. Marcus and Danny went to try to find a way out this morning, heading south along the canyon to see if it opens up. Told them to be back by dark. If you're reading this, we're either dead or we got out. If we got out, we would have told someone about this place. So if you're here and we're not, I'm sorry for whatever you had to go through to find this. Tell my dad I tried. Tell him I thought about him and Mom every day. Tell him I wasn't scared at the end." Rachel read the note 3 times, her vision blurring. Tyler had been injured. They'd split up. Marcus and Danny had gone south looking for an exit. Lila and Tyler had stayed here waiting. She looked around the amphitheater, at the lean-to and the scattered trash, and realized with cold certainty that this had been their last camp. This was where they'd made their stand, hoping rescue would come or that the others would return with help. Jeremy had hung back, giving her space, but now he approached and read the note over her shoulder. His face was grim. If Marcus and Danny went south, we should continue in that direction. The canyon runs for another mile or so before it opens up. Maybe they made it that far. But first, Rachel needed to know what had happened to Tyler and Lila. She forced herself to examine the lean-to more carefully, pulling back the top to see what was underneath. And there, arranged with care, were 2 bodies. They'd been mummified by the dry air, the flesh pulled tight over bones, clothing faded but intact. One wore a flannel shirt Rachel recognized from photos, Tyler. The other wore a green hoodie that had been Lila's favorite. They were lying side by side, hands positioned over their chests, a posture that suggested someone had arranged them after death. Rachel sank to her knees, her breath coming in short gasps that she couldn't quite control. Jeremy's hand was on her shoulder, a steadying presence, and she focused on that point of contact to keep from fragmenting entirely. Tyler and Lila were here. They died here, in this canyon, waiting for rescue that never came. But where were Danny and Marcus? The note said they'd gone south. Had they made it out? Had they died somewhere else in this maze of stone? She forced herself to stand, to think like an investigator instead of a sister. If Danny and Marcus had gone south looking for a way out, there might be evidence of their path. The canyon continued past the amphitheater, narrowing again, and Rachel knew they had to keep going. She pulled out her sat phone to call Martinez, but the signal was gone, blocked by the canyon walls. She made a note of the time and location, planning to check in as soon as they regained line of sight to a satellite. Jeremy had been photographing the scene, documenting everything from multiple angles. He approached Rachel carefully. "We should mark this location with the GPS and continue south. If Danny and Marcus went that way, there might be more signs. But Rachel, we need to be smart about this. We've been hiking for hours in extreme heat. We need to hydrate, eat something, and make sure we have enough reserves to get back out." Rachel knew he was right, but the urge to push forward was overwhelming. Danny had gone south. He'd been alive when he left this place, functional enough to navigate and make decisions. If she could follow his trail, she might find him, or at least find out what happened. She compromised, agreeing to take a 30-minute break to rest and hydrate before continuing. They sat in the shade of the amphitheater, careful to stay away from the area where Tyler and Lila's bodies rested. Rachel forced herself to eat a protein bar and drink a full liter of water, even though her stomach was rebelling. Jeremy consulted his maps and GPS, marking their current location and calculating distances to the canyon's southern exit. According to this, we're about a mile from where the canyon opens up onto a bajada. If Danny and Marcus made it that far, they would have had a choice: continue south toward the mountains or try to circle back toward the road. Given that they'd told Tyler and Lila they'd be back by dark, my guess is they intended to scout ahead and return. But something must have prevented that. Rachel thought about the possibilities. Marcus could have been injured, or they could have gotten lost in the canyon's maze of branches and dead ends. They might have found water and decided to stay put, hoping that someone would follow their trail. Or they could have pushed for the mountains, believing it was their best chance, and died of exposure before reaching help. Every scenario ended in tragedy. After the break, they continued south. The canyon floor became more broken, littered with rockfall from the walls above. They had to climb over boulders and squeeze through gaps where the stone had collapsed, progress slowing to a crawl. Rachel's legs burned with fatigue, and her shoulders ached from the weight of her pack. The heat was oppressive despite the shade, and she could feel dehydration creeping in, despite the water she'd been drinking. The canyon began to descend, a gradual slope that filled Rachel with hope. If it descended, it might lead to lower ground, to a drainage that connected to a larger system, to a way out. She quickened her pace, ignoring the protest of her muscles and the sharp pains in her knees. The light changed as they moved, the walls pulling back to reveal more sky, and suddenly they were at the canyon mouth, standing at the edge of a broad bajada that spread toward distant mountains. And there, sheltered by an overhang at the edge of the opening, was another camp. This one was different, more permanent, with a fire ring built from stacked stones and a series of markers, rocks arranged in lines that pointed in various directions. Rachel approached slowly, her heart hammering. The camp was weathered but distinct, and scattered around the fire ring were items that looked like they'd been deliberately arranged. A backpack, faded blue with a Yosemite patch. Danny's backpack. Rachel crossed the distance at a run, dropping to her knees beside the pack. She pulled it toward her, unzipped it with shaking hands, and found his wallet, his ID, still visible in the clear plastic window, his phone, dead and useless. A notebook filled with entries, a journal he'd been keeping, and next to the backpack, another body. This one had also mummified, but the posture was different, crumpled rather than arranged, as though the person had simply stopped moving and never started again. The clothing was Marcus's. Rachel recognized the band t-shirt from photos. He died here, at the canyon mouth, while Danny had gone for help. Rachel opened the journal with trembling hands, aware that she was about to read her brother's last thoughts. The entries started on August 27th, the day they'd left Las Vegas, and detailed their drive, their excitement, their plan to hike a little ways into the desert for photos. The tone was light, joking references to Tyler's terrible music choices and Lila's insistence on documenting everything for Instagram. But on August 28th, the tone shifted, took a wrong turn. GPS stopped working. Tyler thinks it's military jamming, but more likely we're just too far from civilization. Tried to use the road atlas, but hard to pinpoint our location. Decided to hike toward what looked like a ridgeline. Figured we could get elevation and maybe see a road or landmark. Left markers for the vehicle. Should be able to find our way back by tomorrow. August 29th, Tyler fell. He's in bad shape. Ankle is broken or badly sprained, swelling up fast. We fashioned a splint from branches, but he can't walk. Found this canyon, some shelter from sun. Going to wait here and ration water. Someone will find the car. They'll search. We just have to hold out. August 30th. Water is going fast. The heat is unreal. We're staying in the shade as much as possible, but at night the temperature drops and we're shivering. Tyler is in pain, trying not to show it, but we can see Lila is holding up okay. Marcus is starting to crack, talking about how we never should have come, how this is all his fault for suggesting it. I told him to shut up and save his energy. August 31st. Almost out of water. Took inventory. 4 bottles left. That's not enough. I'm trying to stay positive, but I know the math. In this heat, we need at least a liter per person per day, more if we're moving. We have maybe 2 days if we're lucky. Tyler can't walk. We can't carry him. Marcus and I are going to scout ahead tomorrow, see if the canyon leads somewhere. If we find water or a way out, we'll come back for Tyler and Lila. If we don't, I'm not letting myself think about that. September 1st. Left this morning early. Told Lila to write a note in case something happens to us. The canyon keeps going south. We're following it, looking for any sign of water or human activity. Nothing so far. Just rock and sun and silence. Marcus is slowing down. I think he's dehydrated worse than he's letting on. I'm rationing my water, giving him some of mine. He doesn't know. September 2nd. Made it to the canyon mouth. There's a bahada beyond, leading toward mountains maybe 20 miles south. Too far. We're not going to make it that far. Marcus is sick now. Fever. I think infection from a cut on his leg. We have no medical supplies, no antibiotics, nothing. I'm going to try to reach those mountains, see if there's a road or a ranger station. Marcus can't walk. I told him I'd go and come back with help. He said not to, said we'd both die if I tried. He's probably right, but I can't just sit here and watch him die. I can't go back to Tyler and Lila and tell them I gave up. September 3rd. Marcus died last night. I buried him as best I could with rocks, covered his face so the scavengers won't get to him. I know that's not practical, but I couldn't leave him exposed. I'm going to try for the mountains. Maybe I'll make it. Maybe I won't, but at least I'll know I tried everything. If you're reading this, tell my family I love them. Tell Rachel she was the best sister anyone could ask for. Tell Mom and Dad I thought about them at the end, about all the good times we had. Tell them I'm sorry for being stupid, for thinking I could handle this. The journal entries stopped. Rachel flipped through the remaining pages, but they were blank. She sat back against the stone wall, the journal in her lap, and let herself cry for the first time since the day Danny disappeared. He'd tried. He'd done everything right. He'd left markers. He'd left notes. He'd tried to save his friends and get help. But the desert had been bigger than him, more patient, more unforgiving. Jeremy sat beside her, not speaking, just present. After a while, Rachel pulled herself together enough to photograph everything, to document Marcus's remains and the journal and the backpack. She called Martinez on the sat phone, finally getting a signal now that they were out of the canyon, and reported what they'd found. Martinez was quiet for a long moment, then said she'd dispatch a recovery team immediately, that they could be there by the following morning with helicopter support. "Stay where you are," Martinez said. "Don't go any farther. You've found 3 of them. We'll organize a search for your brother's remains, starting from that location. He said he was going south toward the mountains. We'll work a grid pattern, bring in cadaver dogs. Do this properly." Rachel agreed, but she knew she wasn't going to wait. Danny had left the overhang on September 4th, trying to reach the mountains. He might have made it a few miles, maybe more, but without water, without food, in that heat, the outcome was inevitable. His body was out there somewhere, and she was going to find it. She told Jeremy her plan, and he didn't try to talk her out of it. He just said he'd come with her, that going alone was suicide, and Rachel accepted because she knew he was right. They left most of their gear at the overhang, taking only water, the sat phone, and basic survival equipment. They marked the location with a cairn so the recovery team could find it easily, and then they started south across the Bahada. The terrain was exposed. No shade, the sun a physical weight pressing down. Rachel had never been so hot in her life. Sweat evaporated before it could even cool her skin, and the air felt like it was burning her lungs with each breath. They walked for 2 hours, covering maybe 3 miles, searching for any sign of Danny's passage. Rachel found herself talking to him as she walked, a one-sided conversation that echoed across the empty land. You went this way. You were looking for help. You wouldn't have quit. Tell me where you went. And then Jeremy saw it, a wash cutting across their path, its banks eroded by some past flood. He pointed, and Rachel followed his finger to see something wedged between rocks at the bottom of the wash. It was a boot. Hiking boot, men's size 10, the brand Danny wore. Rachel scrambled down the bank, her hands tearing on sharp rock, and pulled the boot free. Inside, tucked into the toe, was a small plastic bag containing Danny's college ring and a note written on a gum wrapper. Made it this far. Can see the road but can't reach it. I'm sorry. So sorry. Rachel collapsed in the wash, holding the boot, understanding finally that this was as close as she'd ever get. Danny had made it farther than anyone thought possible, had fought longer and harder, but the desert had won. She looked up from the wash and saw in the far distance a dark line that might have been a road. He'd been so close, maybe 5 miles, maybe less. But 5 miles in his condition might as well have been 100. She buried the boot where she'd found it, marked the spot with stones arranged in Danny's pattern, and climbed back up to where Jeremy waited. They stood there for a while, looking south toward the mountains Danny had been trying to reach, and then Rachel pulled out the sat phone and called Martinez. I found him, or I found where he made it to. He came this far, and then he couldn't go any farther. The search needs to focus south from my current location. I'm sending coordinates now. Martinez acknowledged, said the helicopter would come for them within the hour, that they'd done enough and it was time to let the professionals take over. Rachel agreed, and she and Jeremy walked back to the overhang to wait. The recovery team arrived just before sunset. 6 people, including a medical examiner and 2 SAR specialists. They documented the scene, collected Marcus's remains, and prepared to extract Tyler and Lila from the canyon. The search for Danny's body would begin the following morning, weather permitting. Rachel was flown out by helicopter, back to civilization and bright lights and noise that felt overwhelming after days in the desert silence. She gave a formal statement to the Lincoln County Sheriff's Department, turned over all her photographs and notes, and signed papers acknowledging that she understood she'd potentially compromised evidence by conducting an unauthorized search. Martinez was professional but cold, making it clear that Rachel had made her job harder, but Rachel didn't regret it. She'd found answers. That mattered more than protocol. The official search for Danny's remains took 3 weeks. They used ground teams, helicopters and cadaver dogs, working from the wash where Rachel had found the boot and expanding outward in careful grids. They found nothing. The desert had swallowed Danny completely, scattered his bones, or buried them under sand, and after 3 weeks, the search was called off. The official determination was that Daniel Ortiz had died of exposure while attempting to seek help, but his remains had not been recovered and might never be recovered. The story made national news again, a resolution that felt both complete and desperately incomplete. The families held a joint memorial service in Sacramento, and Rachel gave a eulogy that focused on Danny's bravery, his loyalty, his refusal to give up even when survival seemed impossible. The media coverage was respectful for once, the conspiracy theories fading in the face of a tragedy that was entirely human, a wrong turn, a broken ankle, a series of small mistakes that compounded into catastrophe. In the months that followed, Rachel threw herself into work. She finished her law degree, shifted her focus to advocacy work for missing persons' families, and started a non-profit that funded search efforts for cases that lacked media attention or financial resources. She testified before the Nevada State Legislature on search and rescue funding, and she trained volunteer SAR teams in desert survival and navigation. The work was demanding and sometimes heartbreaking, but it gave her purpose, a way to channel grief into something constructive. She stayed in touch with the other families. Tyler Nguyen's sister continued the annual vigils, though they evolved into broader events focused on wilderness safety and SR education. Lila Bosworth's father finally accepted that his acoustic weapons theory had been wrong, and he shifted his energy into advocating for better emergency communication infrastructure in remote areas. Marcus Chen's parents established a scholarship fund for students pursuing degrees in emergency medicine, a quiet way to honor their son's memory. Rachel returned to the site once a year, always in late summer, around the anniversary of the disappearance. She hiked to the stone markers Danny had left, to the amphitheater where Tyler and Lila had died, to the overhang where Marcus had taken his last breath. She left water caches at each location, practical offerings that might save someone else's life if they found themselves lost in this unforgiving landscape. And she sat with her memories, talking to Danny the way she talked to him when he was alive, about her work and her life, and the things she wished she could ask him. Jeremy Kinsella became an unexpected friend. They met up occasionally in Las Vegas or Sacramento, sometimes talking about the case, but more often just sharing meals and conversation that had nothing to do with tragedy. He'd finished his dissertation and taken a position at UCLA, studying the geological processes that shaped desert landscapes. He told Rachel once that working on her brother's case had changed how he thought about his research, that he now saw the desert not just as a collection of rocks and processes, but as a space where human stories played out, often with stakes far higher than anyone intended. On the 5th anniversary of finding the stone markers, Rachel drove back out to the site one more time. She brought flowers for Tyler and Lila, left them at the amphitheater where they died. She stood at the overhang where Marcus had been found, and at the wash where Danny's boot had been, and she hiked out to the spot where the Forerunner had been discovered, where everything had started, and thought about the chain of decisions that had led from there to here. If they'd turned back when the GPS failed, if they'd stayed with the vehicle instead of walking, if Tyler hadn't fallen, if the search teams had looked a little farther northwest, if the weather had been cooler, or if they'd carried more water, or if a dozen other variables had broken differently. But the desert didn't deal in if. It dealt in what was, in the physics of heat and distance and human endurance. And in that calculus, Danny and his friends had never stood a chance. Rachel thought about all the things she might have said if Danny had made it home. She'd have told him he was reckless, that going into the desert without proper preparation was stupid. She'd have hugged him until he complained. She'd have made him promise never to scare her like that again, but she'd also have understood why he tried, why he kept moving when staying still meant waiting to die. Because that's who Danny had been. Someone who believed effort mattered, that trying was its own form of defiance against impossible odds. The Lincoln County Sheriff's Department closed the case officially in the spring of the following year. The final report was comprehensive, running to 68 pages with appendices that included photographs, witness statements, search operation logs, and expert analysis from a desert survival specialist brought in from the University of Nevada. The report concluded that the deaths resulted from a combination of factors including inadequate preparation, navigation error, equipment failure, injury, and environmental exposure. It noted that the victims had made reasonable attempts at survival, but that conditions had overwhelmed their resources. The report included 14 recommendations for preventing similar tragedies. Better signage on remote roads, warning about lack of services and cell coverage, mandatory registration for backcountry travel in certain high-risk areas, expanded cell tower coverage along major routes, additional SAR resources for Lincoln County, public education campaigns about desert survival, emergency beacon rental programs at visitor centers. The recommendations were sensible and well-researched, and Rachel watched as most of them died in committee hearings, where budget constraints and jurisdictional disputes killed good intentions. But a few things did change. The BLM installed a water cache station near the black mailbox on the extraterrestrial highway, a locked container with emergency supplies that could be accessed via a code posted online. A coalition of outdoor recreation groups funded a series of educational videos about desert safety that were shown at schools and visitor centers throughout Nevada. And the Nevada Division of Emergency Management received a modest funding increase that allowed them to add 2 full-time SAR coordinators and upgrade their communication equipment. Rachel tracked these changes the way some people tracked sports scores, celebrating small victories and mourning setbacks. She understood that policy change was incremental, that even small improvements could save lives over time. But she also understood that no amount of infrastructure or education would eliminate risk entirely. The desert would always be dangerous. People would always underestimate it, and some percentage of those people would die because that's what happened at the intersection of human ambition and natural indifference. The conspiracy theories never entirely died. Online forums still discussed the case, still insisted that there was more to the story than the official explanation. Some claimed the bodies had been planted, that the real 4 had been disappeared by the military, and the remains found in the canyon were substitutes. Others suggested that the journal entries were fabricated, that Rachel herself was part of a cover-up designed to distract from whatever had really happened. A few particularly persistent theorists claimed to have evidence, always just out of reach, that proved government involvement. Rachel stopped reading the conspiracy forums after the first year. She'd learned that engaging with true believers was pointless, that evidence didn't matter when people had already decided what they wanted to believe. The conspiracy theories weren't about Danny or Marcus or Tyler or Lila. They were about the people who needed to believe that the world was more ordered and intentional than it actually was, that deaths had meaning beyond the simple fact of biological systems failing under stress. But occasionally something would happen that pulled her back into that world. 3 years after finding Danny's journal, a documentary filmmaker reached out, asking to interview her for a project about disappearances near military installations. Rachel agreed, hoping the film would focus on the human story rather than speculation. But when she saw the rough cut, she realized her footage had been edited alongside interviews with UFO researchers and former military personnel, making wild claims about underground bases and alien technology. She demanded her segments be removed. The filmmaker refused, citing the interview release form Rachel had signed. Rachel hired a lawyer, threatened legal action, and eventually reached a settlement that required the filmmaker to include a prominent disclaimer stating that the Ortiz family disputed the film's conclusions. The documentary was released on a streaming platform, got middling reviews, and disappeared after a few weeks. But Rachel had learned her lesson about trusting outsiders with her brother's story. The 10th anniversary of the disappearance fell on a Tuesday. Rachel took the day off work, drove out to the desert, and hiked to each of the locations that now felt sacred in a way she couldn't quite articulate. The stone markers Danny had left were still there, though wind and weather had shifted them slightly. She repositioned them, restoring the pattern to its original configuration, and added a small bronze plaque she'd had made. In memory of Daniel Ortiz, Marcus Chen, Lila Bosworth, and Tyler Nguyen. They tried. That matters. At the amphitheater, someone had left flowers, plastic roses that had faded in the sun, but still held their shape. Rachel didn't know who'd left them. Tyler's sister, maybe, or a hiker who'd heard the story and wanted to pay respects. She added her own flowers, real ones that would wilt and decompose and return to the earth. She sat for a while in the shade where Tyler and Lila had died, imagining their last days, the fear and pain, and desperate hope that rescue might still come. At the overhang where Marcus had been found, Rachel pulled out Danny's journal, which she'd been allowed to keep after the case closed. She read through it again, hearing his voice in the words, seeing his personality in the way he documented events with a mix of practicality and dark humor. Even facing death, he'd been trying to make sense of things, to impose order on chaos. That was so fundamentally Danny that it made her ache. She hiked out to the wash, where she'd found his boot. The stones she'd arranged in his marker pattern were still there, though one had been displaced by runoff during some past storm. She fixed it, then sat on the bank and looked south toward the mountains he'd been trying to reach. The road he'd seen, the one that had been so close and yet impossibly far, was visible from here if you knew where to look. Highway 6, a 2-lane strip of asphalt that connected Ely to Tonopah. He'd been less than 5 miles away. On a cool day, properly hydrated and rested, that was a 2-hour walk. But in his condition, after days of exposure and dehydration, it might as well have been the moon. Rachel had done the math more times than she could count. If Danny had stayed at the overhang with Marcus, they both would have died. If he'd tried to go back to Tyler and Lila, he might have made it, but then all 4 would have been stuck in the canyon with no way out. Going for the road was the only rational choice, the only option that offered any chance of survival. But knowing that didn't make it easier. Danny had died alone, out here in this wash or somewhere near it, far from everyone who loved him, and that fact would never stop hurting. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple that were almost painfully beautiful, Rachel made her last call to Deputy Martinez. They'd maintained a professional relationship over the years, occasional emails updating each other on related cases or new developments in SEAR technology. Martinez had retired from the Lincoln County Sheriff's Department 2 years earlier, moved to Reno to be closer to her grandkids, but she still kept track of the Ortiz case in the way that cops kept track of the ones that haunted them. "I'm out at the site," Rachel said when Martinez answered. "10th anniversary. Just wanted to let you know in case you were keeping track." Martinez was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about them today. Your brother and his friends. I think about that case more than any other I worked. Sometimes I wonder if we could have done something different, searched farther or looked in different places, but we did what we could with what we had." "I know. And I've never blamed you or your department. You gave it everything. Some things just don't have good endings." They talked for a few more minutes, sharing memories and updates on their lives, and then said goodbye. Rachel sat in the wash until the stars came out, the same stars Danny would have seen in his last hours, and then she hiked back to her truck in darkness, using her headlamp to navigate terrain she knew well enough now that she could probably have done it blind. The drive back to Las Vegas took 3 hours, and Rachel spent most of it thinking about what she'd learned in 10 years of living with unresolved grief. She'd learned that closure was a lie, that there was no moment when pain transformed into peace, and you could file the experience away as complete. She'd learned that you carried loss with you forever, that it changed shape over time, but never disappeared. She'd learned that meaning wasn't something you found, but something you built, that you made sense of senseless tragedy by choosing how to respond to it. And she'd learned that telling the story mattered, keeping Danny's memory alive, not as a conspiracy theory or a cautionary tale, but as a complete human being who'd lived and loved and died trying to save his friends. That was important. If you've been following this journey, if you've stayed with this story through all its painful turns, maybe you understand why it matters to keep telling it. Maybe you'll take a moment to hit that subscribe button, not because you want more content, but because you believe that the people we lose deserve to be remembered fully and honestly. Rachel continued her advocacy work, expanding the nonprofit she'd founded until it was operating in 6 western states. The organization funded search operations for families who couldn't afford private investigators, trained volunteer SAR teams, and lobbied for policy changes that would improve safety and rescue capabilities in remote areas. She won some fights and lost others, and slowly the work became less about Danny and more about all the other missing people whose families were trapped in the same limbo she'd experienced. She spoke at conferences and training seminars, sharing lessons learned from Danny's case. She emphasized the importance of preparation, of telling people where you were going and when you'd be back, of carrying more water than seemed necessary, of turning around when conditions exceeded your capabilities. She talked about the psychology of being lost, how panic and pride could override survival instincts, how important it was to stay put once you realized you were in trouble rather than trying to self-rescue when you lacked resources. And she talked about the search and rescue system, its strengths and limitations, the dedicated professionals who worked in impossible conditions with inadequate resources. She pushed for better funding, for standardized protocols across jurisdictions, for technology improvements that could help locate missing persons faster. Some people listened, some people didn't. She kept talking anyway because that's what you did when you believed something mattered. Rachel never married, never had kids, though both had been part of the future she'd imagined before Danny disappeared. She had relationships, some serious, but they never quite took root. She told herself it was about the work, about being too busy to prioritize personal life, but she knew it was more than that. Some part of her was still in that desert, still searching, still waiting for the resolution that would never come. It wasn't that she couldn't move forward, it was that moving forward felt like leaving Danny behind, and she couldn't do that. Jeremy Kinsella did get married, to a geologist he'd met at a conference in Denver, and they had 2 kids who Jeremy sometimes brought on field trips to the Nevada desert. He'd introduce Rachel to his family when their paths crossed, and his wife would thank Rachel for what she'd done, for the work she continued to do. Rachel appreciated the sentiment, even as she wondered what exactly she'd done. She'd found some answers, she'd turned grief into action, but she hadn't brought anyone back. She hadn't undone anything. On what would have been Danny's 40th birthday, Rachel received a package with no return address. Inside was a worn copy of Desert Solitaire by Edward Abbey, Danny's favorite book about the American West. She'd known he'd owned a copy, but she'd assumed it had been in the forerunner or lost somewhere in the desert. The fact that it had appeared now, 15 years after his death, made no sense until she opened it and found an inscription on the title page. "For whoever finds this, I'm leaving it in this canyon because I won't be carrying it out. Books are heavy and water is more important. If you're reading this, maybe you made better choices than I did. Maybe you prepared better, turned back sooner, told someone where you were going. I hope so. The desert is beautiful, but it doesn't care about you. Respect that." Danny Ortiz, September 2nd. Rachel sat with the book for a long time, trying to understand how it had come back to her. Eventually she called Martinez, who made some inquiries and discovered that a rock climber had found the book wedged in a crack in the amphitheater canyon 6 months earlier. The climber had posted about it on a forum, and someone who'd followed Danny's case had reached out, gotten Rachel's contact information, and sent it on. A small miracle of human connection and the internet's ability to close circuits across time and distance. She kept the book on her desk, a tangible reminder that Danny had existed, that his thoughts and words had weight in the physical world. She read it occasionally, finding comfort in the passages he'd underlined, the margin notes he'd made. He'd argued with Abbey's misanthropy, had challenged his ideas about solitude and civilization. Rachel could hear Danny's voice in those annotations, smart and passionate, and convinced that the world could be better if people just tried harder. The case remained technically open, though no one expected new developments. Occasionally, someone would report seeing remains in the desert that matched the description of a young male, and Rachel would hold her breath while forensic teams investigated. But the remains were always someone else, other victims of the desert's indifference, and Danny remained missing in the official records. Rachel made peace with that, or at least she learned to live with it. She understood that Danny's body might never be found, that the desert might keep that secret forever. What mattered was that she knew what had happened, that she understood the sequence of decisions and accidents that had led from a fun road trip to 4 deaths. That knowledge didn't heal anything, but it was better than not knowing. She thought often about what Deputy Martinez had said years ago, about how most people who died in the desert made a series of small mistakes rather than one catastrophic error. That seemed true not just for desert deaths, but for most tragedies. Life was an accumulation of small choices, each one seeming reasonable in the moment, and you didn't realize you'd crossed into danger until you were too deep to easily retreat. The key was building in margins, redundancies, safety nets that could catch you when the small mistakes started to compound. That's what Rachel tried to teach through her non-profit and her advocacy work. Not that the wilderness should be avoided or feared, but that it should be approached with humility and preparation. That adventure was important, but recklessness was different from courage. That turning back when conditions exceeded your capabilities wasn't failure but wisdom. That telling someone where you were going and when you'd be back was a simple act that could save your life. Some years were harder than others. The 20th anniversary hit Rachel unexpectedly hard, maybe because 44 felt too young for Danny to be frozen at forever. Maybe because it marked longer without him than she'd had with him. She took a leave of absence from work, spent a month hiking alone in the Sierra Nevada, processing grief that she'd thought she'd already processed. She came back different, or maybe just more accepting of the ways loss had reshaped her. She started writing about the case, not for publication but for herself. She wrote about Danny's childhood, his teenage years, the young adult he'd been when he died. She wrote about Marcus and Tyler and Lila, reconstructing their lives from interviews with their families and friends, trying to see them as complete people rather than just victims. She wrote about the search, the investigation, the years of living with uncertainty, and she wrote about what she'd learned, about resilience and advocacy, and the ways people made meaning from tragedy. Some of that writing eventually became a book, published by a small press that specialized in wilderness narratives. Rachel donated all proceeds to SAR organizations. The book sold modestly, got some good reviews, and reached people who'd experienced similar losses. She received letters from families of missing persons thanking her for telling a story that reflected their own experiences. Those letters mattered more than the reviews or sales figures. The conspiracy theorists hated the book, of course. They insisted it was disinformation, that Rachel was either deceived or complicit in covering up what had really happened. She ignored them. By that point, she'd learned that engaging with conspiracy thinking was pointless, that facts didn't matter to people who decided that everything was connected and nothing was as it seemed. She felt sorry for them sometimes, for the way they'd trapped themselves in narratives that required ever more elaborate explanations to maintain internal consistency. Rachel retired at 62, handing over the non-profit's operations to a younger director who brought fresh energy and new ideas. She stayed on the board, but stepped back from day-to-day involvement, trusting that the work would continue without her. She moved from Las Vegas to a small town in the Sierra Nevada foothills, bought a cabin with a view of mountains, and spent her days hiking, reading, and volunteering with the local search and rescue team. She still made the pilgrimage to the Nevada desert once a year, though the hikes were harder now, her knees complaining and her stamina less than it had been. She'd bring flowers for the amphitheater, sit with her memories, talk to Danny about everything that had happened in the intervening years. The stone markers were still there, though she had to rebuild them occasionally when weather or animals disturbed them. She'd added a small plaque explaining what they meant, hoping that other hikers who found them would understand the significance. On what would have been Danny's 50th birthday, Rachel made her last trip to the site. She was 67, healthy enough but aware that hiking in that terrain at her age was pushing limits. She brought her closest friends, a small group of people who'd supported her over the decades, and together they held a ceremony at the amphitheater. They shared stories about Danny and the others, read passages from books they'd loved, and left offerings that would decompose naturally, flowers and written memories and photographs that would fade in the sun. Afterward, Rachel hiked one last time to the wash where she'd found Danny's boot. She left a final marker there, a stone pyramid tall enough to be visible from a distance, and she said goodbye. Not to Danny. She'd said goodbye to him so many times over the years that the words had lost meaning, but to this place, to the ritual of return, to the obligation she'd carried for so long. She was done. The desert could have its secrets. She'd found what she needed to find. The drive back felt different, lighter somehow, as though she'd finally set down a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it wasn't part of her body. She thought about Danny's inscription in the desert solitaire, his reminder that the desert was beautiful, but indifferent. She'd spent decades trying to make meaning from that indifference, to transform tragedy into purpose, and she thought maybe she'd succeeded. Not in bringing anyone back or preventing all future tragedies, but in creating something durable from grief, a structure of advocacy and education and remembrance that would outlast her. If you've followed this story to the end, if you've walked with Rachel through her 20-plus years of searching and learning and finally letting go, maybe you understand that resolution isn't always about finding physical remains or getting perfect answers. Sometimes it's about accepting what can't be changed and choosing how to carry it forward. If that resonates with you, if you believe these stories matter, turn on notifications, because there are thousands of other families out there still searching, still hoping, still needing someone to bear witness to their loss. Rachel lived another 15 years, long enough to see significant improvements in Desert SAR capabilities, long enough to watch technology transform how missing persons cases were investigated and resolved. She saw the non-profit she'd founded expand its reach, saw policies she'd advocated for become standard practice, saw a generation of SAR professionals trained in techniques that might have saved Danny's life if they'd existed when he needed them. She died at 82, peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by people who loved her. Her funeral was held in Sacramento, attended by family and friends and people whose lives she'd touched through her advocacy work. Representatives from a dozen SAR organizations came to pay respects. The director of the Nevada Division of Emergency Management spoke about Rachel's impact on wilderness safety policy. Tyler Nguyen's sister, now in her 50s, gave a eulogy about how Rachel had transformed her own grief into a force that had saved countless lives. Marcus Chen's parents, elderly but still sharp, sat in the front row and wept for a woman who'd been a stranger before. Tragedy made them family. Rachel was buried next to her parents in a cemetery in Sacramento, under an oak tree with a view of the Sierra Nevada foothills. Her headstone was simple, just her name and dates and a quote she'd chosen years earlier. She tried. That matters. It was the same phrase she'd put on the plaque at Danny's marker site, the same philosophy she'd lived by in the decades after his death. Effort mattered. Trying mattered. Even when outcomes were tragic, the attempt to make things better was worthwhile. The Nevada desert continued unchanged, indifferent to human dramas that played out across its surface. The stone markers Danny had left eventually scattered, displaced by wind and animals and the slow processes of erosion. The plaques Rachel had installed were stolen or buried, found years later by hikers who had no context for what they meant. The canyon where Tyler and Lila died, filled partially with debris during a flash flood, its geometry altered but its essential character unchanged. The wash where Danny's boot had been found was scoured clean by runoff, its secrets dispersed. But the story persisted, passed along through Rachel's book, through SAR training materials, through online forums and family gatherings and chance conversations between strangers. It became part of the cautionary canon, one of those narratives that people told to illustrate the importance of preparation and humility in wild places. The details shifted over time, facts blurring into legend, but the core remained. Four friends who made a series of small mistakes and paid the ultimate price, and a sister who spent her life trying to prevent others from making the same errors. The desert kept some secrets. Danny's remains were never found, lost to time and landscape and the patient work of scavengers and weather. But the essential truth of what happened was known, documented in official reports, and Rachel's exhaustive research and the physical evidence recovered over years of searching. It wasn't the ending anyone wanted, but it was an ending, a place where the story could rest, even if questions remained. And in the end, that's what Rachel had fought for. Not perfect closure or divine justice or even a body to bury, but simply the truth of what had happened and the assurance that Danny's death hadn't been meaningless. She'd transformed his loss into a legacy of improved safety protocols and saved lives, had turned her grief into something that served the living. That was as close to redemption as the universe offered, and it had been enough. The story ends here, not because there's nothing more to tell, but because the essential arc is complete. A disappearance, a search, a resolution that was partial but real, and a life spent making meaning from loss. If you've stayed with this story to the very end, if you believe that remembering matters and that bearing witness to tragedy is important, then maybe you understand why these stories need to be told fully and honestly, without sensationalism or false comfort. The desert doesn't offer happy endings, but it offers truth if you're willing to search hard enough and long enough and refuse to accept easy answers. And sometimes, truth is enough.